It's just nice to have a chat, really.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't get too insightful, or even don't get into too much depth. It's just nice to have a natter, isn't it?
It's just interesting. Yeah.
I agree.
I hope this is set up nicely.
Should be calm.
Fantastic.
Hello and welcome to the Will and Alex podcast. In this episode, we interviewed Daniel Gaffiero, a lecturer in health psychology who did his undergrad, master's and PhD at Derby. Within this episode, we discussed chronic pain perception through attentional biases, as well as interpretation biases. And we also looked at this within eating disorders. We talked about Alex's ACL recovery, and we discussed our thoughts on pain in the world of sport. We then looked at health behaviour research and the behaviour change taxonomy, as well as cancer screening. And then we discussed more contemporary health behaviours. This is a jam-packed episode. I hope you enjoy.
So then, Daniel.
This is how you start again. Not to make
Full
him
name.
nervous.
Give us some background info then, Daniel. Tell us a bit about yourself and stuff.
About myself, okay. So obviously I'm Dan, lecturer in health psychology at Derby Uni. I've been at Derby, ironically, through all of my sort of undergrad, masters, PhD. So I guess in some respects, I don't know, I'm part of the furniture in some sense, and now obviously a staff member. And yeah, my sort of background and interests as an undergrad, I really got interested in terms of like health psychology. Masters then went into health psychology, and then PhD in chronic pain, which was kind of a mix of like three areas that I absolutely love, or at least some of the content of three areas that I love, which is evolutionary psych, health psych, and also a bit of clinical psych in terms of clinical populations. So yeah, I suppose that's like a very snapshot
That's
of
your
me.
elevator pitch.
Yeah, there's my elevator pitch. Yeah, there's like, yeah, here we go. This is
fantastic.
my professional self summarised, hopefully succinctly.
So I think what we're both interested in is why you're interested in stuff like chronic pain, health psych related things. Why did you choose to do that? Because we realised that your bachelor's was around maths anxiety, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then your master's was still like attentional biases, wasn't it?
Yep,
So like
certainly.
very
in acute
cog based,
pain.
yeah. And then your PhD was then also rather similar, but it was for chronic pain.
Yep.
Why did you go down that route?
That's interesting that you say that. So during undergrad, especially in third year, and you both will know this because you've just done third year, is that with a lot of the assignments you can choose what you do. And I think, but did both of you do addictive behaviours, for instance?
Yes, I did, yeah.
I didn't.
You didn't. So with a lot of these different assignments, or even if it was, for instance, emotion and context, or if it was, and I don't know if either of you did this, but like human behaviour and evolution, you could choose really the focus of what it is that you wanted to do. So when I was getting into second year, that's where I did the health psychology module, and that's where I became really interested in it. But third year, I did a lot of modules like addictive behaviours, ClinApps, human behaviour and evolution. I can't remember the last one. I think it was family health psychology.
Oh, so they all correlate really.
They all
don't
correlate really well. Yeah.
They all sort of merge together towards what
Exactly.
you've done. Okay, that makes
And
more
what
sense.
was really interesting about those is that for those assignments, all I had pretty much written about was pain, but in different regards. So with addictive behaviours, it was pain in the opioid epidemic. With regards to human behaviour and evolution, I don't want the podcast to go really dark very quickly, but I was talking about, for instance, like suicide and the role of pain in terms of suicide. So evolutionary explanations in terms of that. And then, for instance, with regards to other, like, I'm always really interested in cognitive psychology. Ironically, I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in health, I'm interested in human evolution, and I'm interested in clinical, and just forgot cog, which is like the basis of everything that I've done. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like cognitive psych, my dissertation was on maths anxiety and looking at attentional bias. So I've always been interested in attention and memory, to be fair. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is like all of my assignments were kind of in different ways always related to pain apart from my dissertation because I was just generally interested in maths anxiety. But then I knew for my dissertation I wouldn't necessarily have access to a clinical population, so I kind of had to do it in the lab with acute pain. And that's what happened with my master's. And then from there, with the PhD, you can obviously spread your wings a little bit, so that's where you can start recruiting more clinical populations. But for me, the interest is I know a lot of people say with regards to pain, because pain is so sort of prevalent now. I think one of the estimates was like 28 million adults in the UK experience chronic pain. And I think that number's actually increased because I think that was in 2018. So it's definitely
there's like a lag
increased.
on the data,
Yeah,
isn't there?
yeah, 100%. So I don't have any personal experience of chronic pain or like family members or close relatives.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh, that's what we were getting at.
No,
right, I see.
I've just always found with chronic pain, it's probably one of the most misunderstood sort of illnesses or chronic conditions for various reasons. And I think that's what really sparked my interest, is actually thinking about, okay, well, why is it misunderstood? How can it be better understood? Because a lot of people assume this notion of pain is just purely physical. But of course it's not. It's an emotional, it's a sensory experience as well. So it's inherently psychological. And even now, even when you think about things like patient-practitioner communication, even if you think about some of the definitions of pain, like there's terms that get bandied around like psychogenic pain. And it's like, psychogenic pain, so pain of psychological origin. So basically that just implies that it's in your head. And like, don't get me wrong, pain is processed and in the brain. But to say, or to, just to describe something as just simply psychogenic, I think is quite dismissive of individuals and those terms.
Their experiences, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. This is one thing that I was thinking about actually on the walk here, is that when we say things like, for instance, I feel anxious or I feel depressed, nobody would question that. So, if somebody was to say to me, I feel anxious, I wouldn't say, no, you don't. But then if somebody says, I feel in pain, sometimes individuals will go,
you really?
That's it. And
Yeah.
I always find that really fascinating as to why there is some questioning around that. Sorry, I'm kind of like diverged all the way up there, but that's why I'm
really
interested in it.
Yeah.
It's like many different aspects.
Yeah, all those unanswered questions, and kind of your maybe aim is to start to answer those questions through your research.
And I think what's interesting in terms of like the cognitive aspect. So with pain, there's evidence for different biases. So I talk about attention. Attention is the one that I've primarily focused on. So it's essentially individuals with pain selectively attend to pain-related information over neutral information or environment. That's sort of like a standard definition. But if we go back to, like, let's say, human behavior and evolution, we are all, or pain serves as an interruptive function. The whole purpose of pain, and the reason why we feel pain, is because it's adaptive in the sense that it serves to protect us. When we feel pain, we want to avoid the pain. We want to get away from the source of that particular pain. The issue with chronic pain is that chronic pain is no longer adaptive because pain's persisting beyond that normal tissue healing time. So if you were to injure yourself, let's say, you've got inflammation of the area, for instance, and you're experiencing hypersensitivity in that region. The idea is that you would protect that region so that it repairs itself. Well, when it comes to chronic pain and you're experiencing pain and your attention's being constantly interrupted by the pain and it's gone past that initial healing point, that can be quite a distressing experience. And of course, it can then sort of lead to this sort of vicious cycle of chronicity because you can develop fear of pain. Things like, for instance, you both do physical activity, a lot of physical activity, right? So one of the key things, one of the models is the fear avoidance model of pain, is that individuals can essentially develop a fear of pain, and it forms this chronic cycle whereby individuals avoid, let's say, activities that would actually help.
In fear of.
That would help actually increase their sort of pain tolerance. So like physical activity is, I think some people describe it as like if there was a pill for pain, like to help individuals, it would be like physical activity or something like that. They use those sort of phrases. And because physical activity is so important for individuals, it's one of the best sort of, I suppose, low-level treatments. I don't really know how to sort of phrase that more eloquently. But if individuals are scared because if they take part in that physical activity, that's going to increase their pain and they avoid it, then they might be thinking, well, actually, I'm doing a good thing here because I'm avoiding the pain. But ultimately, what that does over time is it weakens the muscles, it weakens the tissues, and then that increases the threshold at which they subsequently experience pain. So it's almost like an ironic rebound.
Yeah, so it's very much that, like a death spiral, isn't it?
Yeah, and so that's kind of interesting in that sense as well, as thinking about addressing these psychological factors and understanding these psychological factors might actually help individuals, especially with these biases in terms of attention. If we can think about, well, is there a way, if these biases do exist, because there is mixed evidence, I will say, in terms of this. There are some studies that report attentional biases in some populations, some that don't. And then you can think about, well, there's many different forms of chronic pain and things. So could it be, that it's these biases are more potent for some or others? I don't know the answer to that. But if they do exist and you can retrain them, can that then contribute to a better quality of life for these individuals? Mm-hmm. And that would be...
So what do you think is missing? Is it a lack of research, or is it a lack of understanding? Is there a big gap within the research, or do you think people are looking in the wrong direction, sort of thing? What do you think needs contributing towards this?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I think there's a mix of things. I think there's been some fantastic... There has undoubtedly been some fantastic research in actually all of the three main cognitive biases. So I talk about attention, but also interpretation and memory. And more recently, there has been a model that's been proposed. It's called the Integrated Functional Contextual Framework. It actually sort of maps out and proposes predictions of these cognitive biases sort of interacting and influencing each other. So I know I'm kind of like going off, but I'll come back to it. So if you think about like attention and you think about memory, if you attend to something, generally speaking, you're going to be much more likely to remember it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So actually thinking about the relationships between these different cognitive biases and how they interact and influence each other is really important. So when we think about studies and we think about trying to advance knowledge and understand these different biases, often some of the problems are the different paradigms or tasks that are used. So if we just take attention and focus on that, lots of different studies will use lots of different methods. So you can use things like emotional stroop, dot probe, free viewing, XYZ, eye tracking, for instance. And how good these different methods are, or the stimuli that are used, for instance, or the different timings in terms of whether you measure early attention or later attention differ and vary between studies. Mm-hmm. So there's significant variation, which then means it's really difficult to actually pool all of the different results together to try and gain an understanding. But also you've got different pain populations. So it might be that there's, as I mentioned earlier, biases reported in some pain populations, but they're not reported in other populations, and that can be quite conflicting. There's even some studies that have used the exact same methods, the exact same populations, that have found biases, and then repeated that again and not found the same findings. So that could be quite challenging, I guess, in that sense. So the methods can vary. I think as well, the way in which the biases are being measured is also, and I'm guilty of this, so this is a limitation of all of my work, and I'm more than happy to say that. The way in which biases are being measured, or the context in which they're being measured, could be better. So often it's lab-based, but actually what individuals face in their daily situations isn't really as ecologically valid when you're trying to capture that in a lab environment where you're presenting some pictures or some words on a computer screen. Mm-hmm. Actually, if you use more methods, and actually, to be fair, in pain they are moving to that, like even things like virtual reality now, which is really interesting. You gain a much more detailed understanding of how individuals interact with their own real-world environments, and then you can get a much more detailed assessment or a detailed understanding as to what it is that they're looking at in real time, what's capturing their attention, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a range of things, and I think, yeah, in terms of my work and where it's going in future, I kind of need to take on these advancements in the area, or advance what it is that I'm doing, upgrade the methods, keep on top of the literature and think about understanding, but also move away just from focusing on attention, which of course is a huge factor, a huge cognitive bias, but also consider multiple biases and how they interact together, because I think that's where the understanding will be, or the rich understanding will be.
And what are those other biases?
Okay, yeah. That's a good question. So attention, I've mentioned. Interpretation. So interpretation is the tendency to interpret ambiguous information in a pain-related manner. It's ironic, as I'm like recalling these sort of definitions, I can see my PhD thesis. So I'm like, there's the definition. I can literally see it. So yeah, the tendency to interpret ambiguous information in a pain or illness-related fashion. And that, to be fair, actually, what I said about attentional bias, that they can be applied actually to both interpretation and memory, which I'll define in a second, in the sense of there's lots of different paradigms that have been used to measure interpretation. So, like, if I say to you, I'll give you both an example now, and this is a limitation. So, if I say the word pain, you've kind of been primed because we've been talking about pain anyway. But the first thing, like if I was to get an impression of what the word that you would think of, it would be physical pain. It wouldn't be window pain, for instance. Okay. So often you can get tasks like that. Like, all right, I'll give you another one. So terminal. What do you think of when I say terminal?
Yeah, you either think cancer or you think airport.
Exactly. Okay. But the issue with a task, for instance, like that, is that there's differences in the frequency of word usage. So pain, as in physical pain, is used much more commonly than window pain. So you don't have to necessarily experience pain to have that interpretation, if that makes sense. So there's been like a really nice task that's been developed called the Adolescent Interpretation Bodily Task. Or I think I've butchered that, but it's AIBT. Adolescent Interpretation of Bodily Sensations Task, or something along those lines. And it's a really good task because it's like essentially like ambiguous sentences or scenarios. And the idea is that the participants can then fill in the scenario based on their own interpretation. And again, the idea of that is it provides a more objective means of interpretation. So if we go to memory, so memory is really interesting because memory is essentially the tendency to recall pain and illness associated information from memory. So recall is the sort of primary measure or primary outcome measure that's commonly assessed within pain. So it's like sort of standard stuff that you go in COG. You might present like, for instance, a word list of pain words and a word list of neutral words, and you'd find that individuals who have pain, for instance, would be more likely to recall the pain-related words compared to individuals who didn't suffer from pain, in a very basic sense. Essentially, in terms of memory, you've got that element of recall. One thing that I had done, which was slightly different for my PhD, was actually also look at recognition. So recognition is also obviously a form of memory bias. So there is some evidence, again, this is incredibly mixed, but there is some evidence to suggest that individuals who have chronic pain display recognition biases where they're more likely to recognize pain and illness related information. So like, say, for instance, one of the things that I had done was present them with like these scenarios which they can interpret in a pain or illness related fashion. And then a month later, just give them the solutions to those, and there were of course like neutral scenarios, but also ones that could be interpreted in a pain or illness related fashion, and then see, do they actually recognize the pain solutions that they have previously used 1 month earlier. And there was some evidence in some of the work that I had found that individuals who were reporting pain were more likely, if they had interpreted the scenario in a pain related manner, to then subsequently recognize that presented 1 month later. So in terms of that memory element, I would put forward that recall and recognition should both be measured, not just recall itself. Sorry, that's
that's great. That's wonderful.
You are so knowledgeable.
In depth. I don't feel it, honestly.
That's
I think
really
one of it. That's interesting because I don't know. But maybe this might be. It would be interesting to get your perspectives on this. But I always think, like, as I progress through. So when I did my bachelor's, I did third year. I felt quite clever.
Yeah.
And then when I did my master's, I was like, yeah, I think I'm really clever, actually. And then when I did my PhD, I was like, I'm really not that clever.
And it's sort of the more you know, the less
exactly. And I think you get to a point where you think, actually, you know how much you don't know.
Yeah,
I think
it's sort of a Dunning-Kruger effect. Yeah, you get that initial, I'm a genius, and then sort of the more that you learn and sort of traverse through learning and stuff, you're like, I actually know nothing.
That's exactly it, honestly.
Yeah.
So it's like, before and stuff, I'm like, oh, you both know what I'm like. I'm like, oh, you've got to prepare. You've got to know. You've got to, I want to read everything and make sure that I can answer everything in like a really knowledgeable way. And that's because it's like almost you've got like this imposter syndrome thing. Even no matter what level that you get at, there's always more that you can know. And for me, I'm always interested in learning more. I think that's a good thing about me. But then I also think it can be negative aspect because you want to know everything, but you can't. Honestly, no, you certainly can't. I don't think I'd have enough time to learn everything.
I think we'll get onto that in the second half, won't we?
Oh, right, okay.
We'll quiz you a little bit on that.
Okay.
Dan as a person section.
Hold tight, listeners.
I wondered if you had any knowledge of its relation to eating disorders. Because I know more contemporary research is looking at that in the moment. So how you've looked at it in chronic pain, they're starting to looking at it in eating disorders.
Do you mean in terms of the biases?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
And there's more work coming out about that and how like these priming words sort of thing. So like food related terms, or maybe it's shape and weight, body image, etc. And these are like priming terms that they're recalling better than neutral terms. I wondered if you had any insight on that.
That's interesting, because at the moment I've actually got not just me, a group of colleagues, I won't name drop. We are working at the moment on interpretation bias specifically in eating disorders.
Wow.
So that fits quite nicely. So I'll be honest, in terms of my like knowledge, etc., in terms of eating disorders itself, I don't have an in-depth knowledge, but I do know the literature, or some of the literature in terms of some of these cognitive biases in individuals with eating disorders.
I just thought it was interesting that it's a similar concept that's occurring, and whether this is going to be seen through other low-level disorders, that this distress causes this.
Absolutely.
Priming, basically.
So a lot of the literature in terms of like attentional bias actually started with anxiety. That's where it kind of originated from, and quite a lot of the paradigms that are used, I don't know if it used to be abnormal psychology, but I think the term's outdated now, so psychopathology, let's say. So like in terms of generalized anxiety or social anxiety, these tasks are actually quite prominent, particularly attention and interpretation. Moving on to eating disorders, there is evidence to suggest that individuals with eating disorders do display or do show a tendency to, or a negative interpretation bias, essentially, in that, and this is actually interesting as well. I'll get onto this point in a second. But in terms of like the interpretation biases, they're much more likely to see themselves in a more negative manner. Like let's say, for instance, if we think about like weight or shape concerns.
Yes, it's correlated with like low self-esteem.
Yeah, a whole range of those different factors. The interesting thing that I would like to know, and I think this is already, there's some evidence for this in the literature as well, is if we think about this notion of like interpretation bias, so a tendency to interpret things in a more negative manner, with respect to eating disorders, I think there would be like a subtlety in the sense that individuals would show more of a negative interpretation bias to themselves and how they see themselves, as opposed to how they might see other individuals, if that makes sense. Because, of course, it's kind of...
So that was my grant proposal for emotion, basically.
Really?
Yeah. Was that it's more self-reflection than like peers. So I was also looking at perfectionism and that role in it, and that the perfectionist tendencies are also like receive the same. So it's perfectionism on them. They want to make sure that similar to like OCD and stuff like that, is it's them. They want everything to be perfect for them, but they don't mind if a peer or colleague doesn't have those same high standards. And so there's lots of perfectionism scales that will measure those three correlates, basically, like a personal, social, and then there's another one that might be like a group or like public. Sure. So like beyond friends and colleagues, like a stranger type one.
That's interesting.
My ideation was basically that it was the personal aspect that's worth looking at, basically.
I think that's exactly right. I think, especially in terms of where the literature is pointing, I think it is that notion of. So I refer it to as like self and other.
Yeah.
And I think there is that. I don't know what the right term, but like the specificity of the bias, I think it's more nuanced rather than just being generic. I think it is more specific in the sense of that it applies to those individuals. I think it's tied in quite closely with identity as well. So how they see themselves, and I mean it's quite. In terms of like, for instance, attention as well, attention's been very well studied in eating disorders, and there is evidence to suggest as well that individuals display an attentional bias towards, let's say, eating-related information or eating-related stimuli. And there's been a lot of work from colleagues at Derby who have done. So I can think of one staff member in particular who's done a lot of research in terms of attention and eating disorders. So it was quite nice actually, that project, because I can then. Like I said, I like to learn and apply things in different areas and stuff. So me not really having that much insight or knowledge of eating disorders, and then actually thinking about, okay, well, how might these methods, for instance, that I'm utilizing be then applied to different populations, for instance, to study these cognitive biases, is quite advantageous and quite helpful. So yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I'm allowed to like posit questions to you both, but what do you think about in terms of like gym? In terms of like maybe, well, actually I could spin this in terms of both pain, but also, I suppose, like how you see yourself and others. We'll go with the pain aspect actually, because I'm interested in this. So goals. Okay, we all have.
That's later on.
Is that later on?
No, it's fine.
I was going to say I don't want to skip the gun.
Sorry, so your question was?
Yeah, so I was thinking in terms of like, one of the things that's really interesting with pain, and one of the areas that I might start thinking or looking into now is like sort of athletes and their experiences of pain. Now, I'll admit, I've only just started going to the gym for about 6 months, okay? Now, from listening to your podcast, you both have got, I know you hurt your, did you tear your ACL?
Yeah.
So you're currently repairing that, recovering from that.
Did a 5K on Saturday.
He did like a 23-minute 5K on Saturday. The doctor said he had like
impressive.
8 months to recover. It's only been what?
2.5.
So in terms of goals, you've got very, you're straight there. Yep, that's good.
So he had his ACL surgery, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, the doctor says it's going to take about 8 months. I'm planning on doing it in August. And I was like, we'll see.
Yeah, he told me, he said, everybody that has an ACL comes out and says, oh yeah, I'm going to be back on my feet and be running again and not in like 8 months. And he says, Virgil van Dijk, you don't know if you watch football or not, but he's a huge centre-back at Liverpool, absolute star, and he took 8 months to get back to training football. A little bit different than just running a 5K. And he said, you're not Virgil van Dijk. Take 8 months to a year to go and run again.
So how long has it been? How long have you recovered from that?
Yeah, so it's been two and a little bit months.
But you've done the 5K.
Like, the surgery was like 2 months ago.
that podcast on motivation. That must be like you must have insane motivation to.
It's not necessarily motivation. It's more like I've waited for so long to be able to do that, and I want it so bad.
Yep.
In that doesn't necessarily have to be a set goal. That's more my internal monologue. Setting that, and I'm just vocalizing it. It's not like I write down that, but it's for me to sit down and think, okay, how am I going to achieve that? I booked myself a PT. I was doing loads of research into ACL recovery, looking at all the stats, say, okay, if I do this, what is the risk of me tearing it again and I'm buggered? Or if I do this smartly, can I recover very quickly? And the answer is definitely yes.
Okay.
Currently, they don't recommend you getting the surgery for the type of tear that I had.
Okay.
Because it's so recoverable that you can just have 4 months of PT sessions and you're back to normal pretty much without an ACL. So I could be better than I was before if I recover quickly.
I think your philosophy for it was really good though as well, because you were saying about how the doctor says it's going to take 8 months for you to recover, and then even then you're going to be like not so stable. It's like the reason you're having this surgery in the first place is so that you can be back to like your normal self and be back to 100%. So I think it was really nice to hear that like that's what you were after. So you weren't going to settle with, oh, let's repair it and then I'll be able to like hobble everywhere for the rest of my life. It's like, no, I'm getting it repaired so that I can go back to doing running, tennis, squash, whatever, swimming, etc. Yeah.
And as soon as he said that to me, I felt as if, all these people that are coming in to have that surgery and don't have that maybe information around them that I'm able to read literature and understand it, and all these people that around me that will push me, is like, actually no, Alex, you can achieve that. You can go out and run as you used to. If I didn't have that, I would have just listened to that doctor and taken his advice and not done anything, and I'd be hobbling around after a year and a half. But I've kind of diverted away from your.
No. I mean,
it's
just interesting though, because like to have done. Virgil van Dijk takes 8 months to recover or so long, even longer. And I think, to be
Alex
fair,
Kilbury of Burton.
I don't want to upset Liverpool fans, but I don't think they did too well this season anyway. Yeah. So I don't know. Was it? I think I can't remember even seeing Virgil van Dijk, or maybe he was there for part of the season.
Yeah, he played, but not very well. He hasn't been the same afterwards.
He's not been the same afterwards. Yeah, that's for sure. So that's it. My original question. I guess it kind of it does relate. I imagine the ACL was very painful when you. Just out of interest, how did that happen? Was it just, were you doing exercise?
I was playing football. I was just jockeying a guy, twisted, pop, fell. It wasn't that bad really. It was like a 2-second window of huge amount of pain.
Yep.
Probably the most amount of pain I've ever felt. And then gone, nothing. And it would just give way occasionally. But there was no real pain there unless it gave way. And then it was only like a 2 or 3 second like burst of pain. So not too bad.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm glad to hear it wasn't like excruciating for a prolonged period. But yeah, my question in terms of like, so I was thinking in terms of like, in terms of individuals, like for instance, who are athletes, maybe more in like contact sports, let's say, there's almost like implied within the nature of the sport itself that there is going to be an element of physical pain, or an element of pain in that, right? Because it's like, if you think about rugby, for instance, it's like you're literally clattering into each other. So I'm trying to like think of the question that I'm trying to say rather than just make it like a generic lecture to you both. But like, do you think, I suppose, that there are differences in terms of individuals who have got that mentality where, they know that pain is part of the sport experience? So there's almost like a tacit acceptance that pain is like an intrinsic part of taking part in that sport, versus, let's say, for instance, individuals who might not be taking part in sport that are experiencing pain. Do you think there's some sort of, I suppose I'm trying to think of it in terms of like, I don't know, like a cognitive mechanism or something like that. I'm really poorly articulating this question. But you kind of see you catch my drift there? Yeah.
I think that maybe there is your threshold of pain can increase.
Okay.
And if that's physical or it's an emotional thing of your body anticipates pain better and so it can regulate against it, or your actual physical threshold decreases. I'm not unsure of that, which mechanism's more powerful in that. But definitely, I think that people who engage in sport or at least take more pain, have higher thresholds.
I think that's a good point in terms of like threshold and tolerance. That's one thing I'd be interested in, is actually, do they have elevated levels of that? Because it's almost, again, it's that notion that just because that's potentially going to be a consequence. Like people who go to the gym, for instance. Again, I don't know lots of things about like X, Y, and Z or physiology and stuff like that. But I'm pretty certain people say like no pain, no gain. I know that's not technically true, because you don't need to feel pain to build muscle, etc. I think I'm right in saying that. Again, I'm a novice here in this respect. But there's almost, for some individuals, it's almost like that mindset of like, I have to feel pain. I have to like feel really exerted, and
they revel in it.
Yeah, it's like some sort of like really key.
Some David Goggins stuff.
I have seen. Yeah, David Goggins is just insane.
It's quite a misconception, though, isn't it? Because for non-contact sport, that doesn't apply.
Exactly.
There's no need for this pain aspect.
Exactly.
When you're in the gym doing like weightlifting or something like that, people like to get the burn or something, and the day after they like to feel sore because it feels like they've had a really good session.
That's the thing. Yeah.
But there is, if you lift heavy, you don't get as much delayed onset muscle soreness compared to if you're doing lightweight for lots of reps. But strength training is high weight, low reps. So if you wanted to be stronger, you'd actually you'd get less DOMs and you'd have less fatigue the day after. Yeah. And sort of people sort of revel in this, I'm really tense the day after or whatever. I was like, I can barely walk down the stairs. I've done that many squats or whatever. And it's like, that's sort of counterintuitive, and you're sort of just chasing this pain for no reason. But then also you were saying about how contact sports
why do you think people chase the pain? That's I'll open it to both of you. That's the interesting thing. Is like, because you're right. It's that notion of like a misconception. That's the interesting thing for me. It's like, why do people chase it?
I think is it sort of they believe that there's this sort of long-term payoff sort of thing. Is they think it's this short-term period of endurance, and then hopefully there'll be a reward at the end of it. Sort of like, I don't know, like reading a book maybe. Is that you don't get any initial reward. The reward is the end of the book, and to be able to be disciplined to actually just turn through a few pages is sort of the pain aspect, and then at some point you'll get the reward. It's like how you're on about contact sport with rugby. You're bashing into each other and pile driving each other. Whereas with something like running, there's more. It's the cognitive aspect. It's like, I really don't want to go for a run, and then going on a run, or like doing a plank if you're doing an ab workout. It's like, let's go for 2 minutes, and then you're at 1 minute 50, and you think, God, I'm knackered, and then you think, shall I just ignore my brain for a minute? And then, wow, I can go for 5 minutes. This is crazy. And it's like,
I've always kind of seen it as two things. I think it as like a desire of people to not live a cushy life, to feel like life is very mundane and easy, so to make it not easy is to experience suffering or pain, and a way of doing that isn't actually too detrimental to your life is to work out hard and feel that and push through it. And then the other reason that I think about quite a lot is people want a reward or a validation of that effort. And a lot of the time when you're in the gym initially, or as you've been going for a while, you stop seeing the physical things. You stop seeing the gains, or they're very minute, so you don't notice them. And your way of seeing that reward for that exercise is
the validation
pain.
through the
So is it almost like a case that it becomes like diminished over time?
I mean, so you reach you start plateauing, don't you?
So if you've been lifting for like 2 to 3 years, your gains are so minimal, it's unbelievable. If you're just starting out, you're going to develop so fast because you've not reached anywhere near your potential.
I think I've heard that, and again I might be talking absolute nonsense here, like newbie gains.
So like that's 100% the term.
So like even, and again I'm not well versed in this at all, but there's some stuff like, even if you're like a newbie and you might not be like really correct in terms of your form lifting weights, the fact that you're still doing something actually results in sort of muscle growth.
You could literally fall over all the gym equipment and it would still be beneficial for you.
that sounds great.
Like using the leg extension as a bicep curl, it would still benefit you massively because you're so far beyond your so far from your potential that you've got so much to grow for. But then once you reach that like 90% threshold of your potential, then it's like to get half an inch on your bicep, it might take like 3 years. It's going to be so minimal, and maybe that requirement is pain to validate all this effort in the first place.
I just find it really sort of fascinating, like the different ways in which people, you're all there for like let's just say in terms of the gym, you're all there for a same objective. Maybe it's actually not the same objective, but you're all there working out essentially. But then individuals are much driven by different things, and then it can be, again, it's like somebody really, really loves the fact that they've done so many different squats or whatever that when they get up they can't, their legs are just shaking like jelly. It's like, but you don't need to do that, if that makes sense. So I mean, I just find, I don't know how we've got to like physically do those things, but it's super interesting.
I see like a pattern in kind of what you've been saying through the podcast so far, in that you ask tons and tons of questions, and you kind of maybe your work is kind of worked around those questions, even in little projects that you're getting involved with. So I'm curious to know how you interpret the constant research into the more wider currently research things like smoking or like behaviour interventions within exercise and that kind of thing. What do you feel about the constant research still being pumped into that, even though we pretty much understand all the mechanisms behind it?
So this is what I
get at, okay, so like in terms of like behaviours like
so
like
this
smoking.
is what I was on about to you, about how people are still churning out smoking literature, even though we've had enough of that for about 50 years now.
There are certain areas that are definitely saturated. So I mean, you could say in terms of things like smoking, etc. Alcohol consumption, I guess. Like, I mean, when I'm saying sort of saturated, I mean, it's like fairly evident in terms of the literature. It's crystal clear, that these are not good behaviours to perform. They're detrimental to health. And in terms of the literature, in terms of behaviour change, it's really interesting because I actually think in terms of behaviour change itself now, it's going in a it's going in a really great direction. So things like, for instance, the behaviour change technique taxonomy and I think they're revising that by Mitchie. So it's like basically a whole list of behaviour change techniques that are grouped into various different sort of factors.
So is that like 93 or something?
93, clustered techniques, hierarchically clustered techniques. And like, so essentially it could be like, say for instance, if you're wanting to think off the top of my head, like increase an individual's self-efficacy, for instance, so that would be like a mechanism of action. You can go to a behaviour change taxonomy and you can think about, okay, well, what techniques might, for instance, be linked or associated with that mechanism of action? So like one of the things you could think about just as an example is like, one of them is like instruction on how to perform a behaviour. And we know through like just general self-efficacy theory, vicarious experience, observing someone do something. Let's say in the gym, right? I'll admit I've done this myself, right? If it's like a deadlift, right? I'm like, okay, I don't really know what position to be in. Am I doing it right? There's a person right there who's doing a deadlift. I'm just going to kind of like not make eye contact with them because I don't want to get knocked out, but look like sort of in the mirror to see what they're doing. And then it's easier to then repeat that behavior. So yeah, I mean, like techniques and the taxonomy is brilliant because it will give you examples applied to specific behaviors, and it defines what the actual technique is as well.
It's really handy.
It's super handy. They're actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're actually updating it, and they've got like a whole website that's just recently been produced. It's a lot of the stuff from, I think it's University College London. But the reason why I say that's so important is because a lot of research before that was looking at sort of behavior change would say that they're using these techniques, and this was before the taxonomy, or this is one of the reasons why the taxonomy came about. They would say that they're using these techniques, but then when you actually look at their sort of intervention, it's either that they are not using those techniques, they're using something different, or they're poorly defining them in the first place. And so then it's like, well, there's no evidence for this technique. It's like, yeah, but you haven't actually used that particular technique. So a lot of the times in terms of like the outcomes, in terms of behavior change, what's effective and not effective has previously been quite all over the place, even for things like smoking interventions and so on. But now that's going in a better direction. But I think it's also you have to sort of consider, like, for instance, like population-based statistics, I guess. So like you're with behavior change where it's at now, for instance, let's say, just off the top of my head because I know a little bit about it, like if you're trying to promote a behavior like testicular self-examination, you'll target young males because the literature suggests that it's young males who are least likely to perform that behavior. And then you can think about, and this is why I love the behavior change stuff. So the question I'd ask myself then is, okay, why are they not performing the behavior? The literature will give you some idea as to why they're not performing the behavior. Maybe it's a lack of knowledge of how to perform a TSE, for instance, testicular self-examination. Then it's like, well, then you can use that taxonomy to think about, okay, well, then what can we do to map on to increase that level of knowledge, if that makes sense? So if they don't know how to perform it, well, the most effective means of changing that would be give them information that shows them how to perform it. If it's a case that they forget, then maybe forming, for instance, a plan or setting a goal or an action plan, or, you know, even there's lots of stuff about like implementation intentions. But anyway, I know I'm going like quite far off. I love this stuff. Yeah. I genuinely love this stuff.
It's great though for stuff like that because both like breast cancer and testicular cancer, it's their like recovery rate or treatment efficacy is really high. It's the fact that you're just identifying it being there. And so like identifying that like younger males and females for both breast cancer as well, because that's the same actually. They're the most popular cancers, and yet they are the most they have the best treatment efficacy basically. And so it's about identifying it earlier on, like as soon as possible.
Early identification is the key thing. And the interesting thing the interesting thing with it is like one of the most common barriers is fear of finding something.
Yeah, which is
so it's like there's and this is the thing about risk. Even, you know, like with testicular self-examination or breast self-examination, there is inherent risk when you perform that.
Well, it comes back to your chronic pain thing, doesn't it? About how exercise would benefit them, but they're scared of doing it because of more pain. It's the
like
same
an
thing,
ironic.
Isn't it? There's if they do the examination to help them prevent from getting something or from it being severe, they're actually worried about doing it in the first place,
exactly,
and so won't do it, and so will abstain from doing examinations.
And that's why there's lots of stuff. So like in terms of like there's stuff about like persuasive communication. It's called like gain or loss frame messaging. So like gain is like you can outline the benefits of performing a behavior. Loss, you can outline the consequences of not performing a behavior. These loss frame messages are much more effective for these sorts of behaviors because it's this element of saying, well, if you don't do this, then you won't identify this early, and then obviously that has a more negative outcome for you. So it's it's really interesting in that sense. And so in terms of like the behaviors, in terms of the original question, there are definitely like behaviors where there's just loads of research and it's like kind of like, so like with smoking, with alcohol and stuff like that. But I think with other behaviors, more research is needed, and there's a really important role for behavior change. So like I've said, in terms of like you can even say, like, for instance, vaccination uptake. You can say, for instance, as we've discussed, breast or testicular self-examination. One thing that's interesting as well, actually, that I've been doing a bit of reading on at the moment is prostate cancer, because there's actually no current screening program for prostate cancer. The reason why I've like been researching that is I'm just like developing part of content for an online module, and that was I was doing some research in like behavior change and different behaviors and things, and like it was more focused on the case of screening, and that I didn't know that shocked me. that there is no screening program. Because then the issue associated with that basically there's no screening program because something about the effectiveness of it hasn't been proved or something. But then one of the common things is like
defeating the point that anything would help, though, basically, isn't
it?
I
mean, it kind of gives like a wrong sort of, and then individuals have to kind of go to their GP, and basically you can have like a PSA test, which is a blood test to check for elevated levels. And it's generally a good test. The only issue with that, I think, in terms of like sensitivity or specificity, it's not the most accurate test, so you often need something else as well, which I think is a digital rectal examination. But there are so many barriers that prevent men in the first place, because men generally, in terms of, I won't say all men, but just from the literature, from what I've seen, these topics can be quite taboo. So things like a digital rectal examination, that can be quite, okay, I don't want, it's embarrassing.
That's no fun, is it?
Yeah. And so it's almost like a case of, if you're having to actively take that responsibility and go, right, I need to see my GP and I have to ask for these sorts of things, that can just be an inherent barrier in and of itself. And then individuals might just be less likely then to actually, if they're experiencing symptoms of prostate cancer, actually seek help for that, which shouldn't be the case, if that makes sense. It should be a case that it's kind of more normalised. And to be fair, prostate cancer is doing actually a lot of good stuff at the moment to try and more normalise that and distribute sort of knowledge.
They've got massive campaigns for it, and I think they're pushing that like 1 in 3 men get it.
I think that is the statistic.
That's the one that they push, But again, as soon as you find it, it's readily treatable.
Absolutely, and the interesting thing is that a lot of people, this is the term. I'm trying to get the actual terminology of the language right here because it's important. I think prostate cancer is, it's a case of people die with it, not from it.
Yes.
So it can be one of those that you actually, typically it's diagnosed in older men, I believe. And it's a case of, it can be, I can't remember what the term is used. I think it's like wishful waiting or something like that. That might be wrong. But essentially you can kind of just monitor it, and it won't spread, or it won't, sort of impact you to the point where it will be responsible for.
So it's benign sort of thing.
It's like so slow growing. Yeah. So, and then in that case, so like I said, it would be like you die with it, not from it. It will be some other illness, for instance, that you'll die from. But of course, there are exceptions to that as well. Of course, if it's more fast growing, it can, this is the thing I find as well. I appreciate in terms of like screening. It's like, in terms of the funding, it's like they're trying to identify the appropriate age ranges where it's most, sort of beneficial. But of course, it's like cancer, when we think about screening programs, and it's like, okay, well, you've got this minimum age range and it's from here and it's every few years. It's like, it's not like cancer sort of goes, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to, I'm going to just fit within those periods, if that makes sense. Yeah. But of course, yeah,
I think that's really important. I think we mentioned a while ago about the statins and about the screening for whether you might need one.
I remember you mentioning that.
And I think it's general protocol that they do it at like 50s, and Dr. Peter Attia was like, start at 40s. There's no reason to look where it's most common. Look before it's most common, so you can address it earlier, and that maybe taking 10 years off when this screening should be done. So whether typical screenings at 40 you should start, then start educating people at 25. And get them like ready and like become professionals at self-examinations for themselves, rather than being like, oh right, you're turning into the most common range, now's the time to learn how to do it. Whereas if they'd been practicing and doing it do you know what I mean?
No, I completely understand what you mean. But I mean, like just in terms of the sort of, I suppose I'm like trying to go back to I give you, it's like with the question, I just like, I go off on tangents everywhere, like 100 things just pop into my mind.
It's difficult though, isn't it? Because you say something, then you've got to define it, and then come back to it, and then there's a model that's came out, and then explain all that.
It's like layers,
and then there's
it does not need to link back to the question. We're just having a chat.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, but no, I think you're completely right. There are definitely some areas that are saturated in terms of the literature. I think the general direction of behaviour change is going in a really, really positive direction. And I think, like I said before, like the behaviour change technique taxonomy, which is fantastic, I love it. And also they're updating at the moment, like the links between the techniques and like the mechanisms of actions and things like that. so they've got like it's like a colored diagram where there's like strong evidence, where there's like sort of minimal evidence, or if there's no evidence and stuff, and like that's just so helpful. So like if you were to design behavior change interventions in the future, you've got such a resource bank to be able to deliver a really effective intervention.
And that's great for personal use as well, actually. I really like it because I do a lot of them subliminally. But then when you go on, you go, oh, that's what I've been doing for this, and that really worked actually.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, there's others out there.
You can definitely apply these sort of techniques to your own sort of like personal life and things like that. Like for me, one of the key barriers, if we go back to like gym and stuff, one of the key barriers for me is like I didn't know what I was doing. So like, and you can go and search the internet, but then it's like people say so many different things. You should do this exercise program. You should do this exercise program. Well, this one's better than this one because of this.
You
or
have
this
to
one
filter through so much misinformation
and, it's like,
and poor advice.
That's
it's
it.
Unbelievable.
And so I was like, what can somebody just give me like
a real answer?
Just tell me.
It's the fact that extrapolates from just gym. I mean, we were reading a study not too long ago, and what was it? 52% of all information on TikTok about
is
ADHD.
Misinformation.
Well, I'm glad I don't have TikTok.
Like complete misinformation, not just
really?
like poor, shoddy advice. Like they were being someone who was like thought they were an authoritative and advocate for this sort of focus of research, and literally just providing awful information, like pure misinformation, from a standpoint where people are watching it thinking they're an authoritative figure, someone who knows about it in depth.
This is where all that the kind of things that we're talking about needs to be so mainstream, and where those kind of frameworks that you're on about, that taxonomy, would be amazing. Imagine trying to edit that into like a self-help program and making that widely available. It'd be amazing. People could access that.
I completely agree. And there's lots of tools and things like they've even got. I think they've got an app now with all of the techniques and things.
Really?
Yeah. Like I definitely would recommend it. But you're absolutely right. And I think in terms of like interventions now, so this is why like theoretically informed interventions are much more effective than interventions that aren't theoretically informed, because there's you can think about that link between okay, so why is it that individuals aren't engaging in this particular behavior? What are these barriers or facilitators? How can we target those? And you can use theoretical models to give you sort of insight into what it is that you could target. And then you can use those specific behavior change techniques, which are clearly defined, and which then everybody, it's like the gold standard. So everybody's adhering to that. So everybody's on the same level in terms of what it is that they're utilizing. And then it just means that when you're then evaluating the literature and seeing how actually effective a behavior change intervention is for a specific population, for a specific behavior, it's so much easier to understand than if everybody's just doing different things and adhering to different frameworks and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's going in a really good direction in that sense. And in terms of like things like misinformation, there's misinformation with regards to so many different behaviors. Like even with like vaccination, there was a study that was done, I think it was the measles outbreak in either 2018 or 2019, I can't remember. I'm just like remembering like a study off the top of my head. But they did like a study of Facebook pages, and they found that anti-vaccination pages grew by 500%, whereas pro-vaccination pages had grown by 50%. So like it's just interesting in terms of like Twitter's quite there's a lot of misinformation on Twitter and things. But that's the thing, is like in terms of like critical thinking, it's about thinking about or having the awareness of appraising this information and actually thinking about, okay, well, where does it come from? What's the evidence behind it, if there actually is any evidence? And then that it's a real skill to actually be able to then think, well, okay, well, this is clearly misinformation. This is not reliable, X, Y, and Z. That's why critical thinking is so important, in terms of being able to assess the authenticity of a source and actually whether there's any facts and things behind it, which is, something that you get from, I guess in some sense, it's not good to be exposed to misinformation, because then some individuals, fall into that trap of going down that line and sort of believing in these things, which can then be really harmful to themselves. But also in a case, it's like if you're able to then discern, okay, this is clearly misinformation, it kind of like sets you up for you're more I don't know how to sort of formulate it into words, but it's like you're more skeptical. Yeah, it's like you're much more you really consider this sort of the information that you're being presented with, and you're assessing all of its different features essentially, which I think is really important. So you should never really take things just at face value. It's kind of, you need to consider the evidence. That's the whole point in terms of, just science generally. It's like it should be evidence based.
Definitely. we kind of wanted to pick your brain on a couple other things.
Oh God!
And
Yeah.
it's no pressure if you don't know too much of that evidence base around it. But kind of, what did you feel about like saunas, steam rooms, and then
some more, like more novel health-related protocols and stuff.
That's interesting.
The Brian Johnson-esque
Yeah.
apparatus.
I'll be honest. I have no idea. Genuinely, I have no idea. Never been in a sauna.
Never been?
No, never been in a sauna.
Would
Although
you?
to be fair, at the moment in the UK, it just feels like you're constantly in a sauna, or at least where I live, it feels like it's constantly in a sauna. No, but I tell me your thoughts about them, and then maybe I can like think on my feet.
You must have thoughts surrounding it. We're not looking for all this theory and information.
Okay,
and
all
definitions.
right, okay.
We're more just surrounding your opinion on it.
What, like in terms of like benefits, or
Yeah, and like, would you engage in it, etc.? Do you think there's benefit to it? Do you think people should look more into it?
How about we pitch it to you?
Okay,
and
go
you
for it.
can Tell us.
Yeah.
Go on.
Well,
So,
well, you might convert me. So let's go.
So, well, salt being one of them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you've put a very convincing and compelling case for salt.
So, Eastern populations, mainly Japanese, Korean, Chinese, etc., have the greatest lifespan. Japanese people live to like 93. Their average lifespan is so much higher. In the UK and US, it's like 72. It might have gone up a little bit, or might have gone down a little bit because of COVID, actually. But it's standard to be 72. In Japan, it's like 93. And at every meal, they eat salt-based products. Salted fish, kimchi, which is brine, which is salt water, cabbage, stuff like sauerkraut, etc. They have like brined fish, fermented foods, all things that are like ludicrously covered in salt. And their hypertension figures are flatline, basically. They've not increased. Whereas in the UK and US, as salt consumption has remained the same, hypertension has grown 300%. So that's obviously correlation is not causation, but that's quite indicative that maybe salt is not the issue here. And obviously sugar has continually rose.
Is there any differences in like sedentary behaviour? I don't know. I'm just interested in terms of like, is it like diet and lifestyle factors? So diet makes complete sense in what you're saying there. Is there I don't want to put you on the spot. Is there differences in general lifestyle? So like I would think is there like are they generally more active, let's say?
I wouldn't, without any
empirical
literature or anything,
Yeah.
there isn't much difference.
Okay.
But from physical standpoint, a lot of Eastern populations are thinner, and I think it's very much diet oriented.
Okay.
Physical activity within sort of physique and activity is probably only 30% of the issue.
Okay.
Like, you can work out and go running and stuff, but if your diet is awful, that's sort of the foundation. It doesn't matter how far you run. If you eat 7,000 calories and you only ran for 300 calories worth, then you're going to gain weight. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
And so regardless of whether the Japanese population are slightly more active or not, is probably besides the point, because diet is so much more important.
That's a good point.
Within sports, we kind of dipped our toe into this a little bit, and Eastern cultures massively decrease in exercise. I mean, there's quite a noticeable difference. So their cultures don't prioritise exercise. It's more like academic is kind of the thing that's pushed, especially within children. And within adults, it's expected to work longer, and women don't exercise at all, traditionally. That's like a very generalised point of view, but that's kind of what literature's supporting. So I think, if anything, there's less exercise going on within Eastern cultures, which would even more support the strength of nutrition.
Yeah. So with saunas,
and
just interesting.
Right, sorry.
Yeah,
I was going to go back. I was going to go back to salt, but that's
no.
All
go
right,
on. No, go back. Go on.
Salt is also a negative feedback loop. So the more you have, the less you want it. Whereas with sugar and other,
the more you have, the more you want.
Yeah. So with sugar, eat a little bit. That's tasty. Let's have some more. With salt, once you're satiated, that's it. You won't consume anymore. And so there's not this endless pit, basically, of you're getting far too much salt. You can eat to taste, basically. It's like, the food's actually really bland and undersalted, but I'm doing that because of health reasons. And it's like, maybe you actually need to follow this craving. and this craving is actually indicative that you've got too little salt and that you need to supplement. And therefore it's quite a good rule of thumb really, is that salt to taste, and that you'll probably increase your consumption naturally through that. You don't really need to like do what we do, where we take salt in the morning or anything like that. That's really unnecessary. You can just put more salt on your food regularly, and that'd be such an easy way to get your regular dose. And then there's a massive study out there that took, I think it was 15,000 people, and took all their dietary requirements from a big survey that was conducted on diet and stuff, and found that WHO, so the World Health Organization, recommended only 1 teaspoon of salt a day. But the curve that was plotted found that anything less than 3 teaspoons was had negative effects basically, and that it was sort of a bell-shaped curve. Is that there was an optimum amount, but too much was poor, and too little was also detrimental as well. And that WHO's recommendation was on this detrimental line, is that you actually wanted to push the boundaries a little bit more. But then if going exceeding a lot of salt, so having loads of salt, it was actually difficult to get into that detrimental area. You'd have to have like 10 tablespoons of salt to get the same detrimental effect as if you just had only 1 teaspoon of salt a day. So it required a lot more. You could overdose on loads of salt and it not be that detrimental, compared to if you had too little. It was very detrimental on all-cause mortality and cardiovascular diseases. So
you know your stuff about salt, don't you?
That was a year ago you did that paper.
And he's still got it all there. It's all there, just easy to
so then
ping off the mind.
And then saunas really. Norwegians have been doing it for ages. It's a very Scandinavian tradition. A lot of households have saunas. Germans usually have saunas in their houses. Apparently it's great for all-cause mortality again. It's not really specific to anything really. Yeah, it's just all-cause mortality generally, isn't it? Is that it's beneficial for you. Doing it would help.
It kind of works on vasoconstriction, vasodilation.
Okay.
So as your blood flow massively increases, and specifically to your head, it's the point at which you lose the most heat. So as you warm up, so much blood's being pumped to your head because it wants to get rid of the heat. And so your brain is working on overdrive to get all the blood round it, and so it's pumping lots of, it kind of worked from lots of the hormones and things that, and like dopamine, noradrenaline, that kind of things that are being produced around your body. Specifically, a lot of the ones that are in your gut are going towards your brain very quickly, and so you're getting huge dopamine hits. It's very similar to like you get the same amount of dopamine from doing cocaine, but it lasts from rather being like half an hour to being 6 hours, the same hit.
Yeah,
it's
from as little as 10 minutes in the sauna, basically. Yeah, in a standard sauna. Yeah,
I was going to say that's super interesting. Like I've never. I'd be lying if I've said that in my life I've spent more than 2 minutes thinking about saunas. I think I'm going to have a look a lot more now in terms of I don't know. I always. It's interesting because I thought it was kind of. Do you both do them? Do you both engage? And do you feel like it has like really good benefits in terms of?
I enjoy it. Yeah. I enjoy it as on its own, regardless of whether it had any benefit. Okay. I would still engage with it after a workout. It's so relaxed because your blood flow. Obviously, you don't know, but you can feel it, like that it's improving blood flow. You just feel relaxed. There's less tension, and I feel like I recover quicker through sauna use, and so it's better for me because I can just lay in the sauna for 15-20 minutes and get out, and then know that I've decreased my recovery time by like a good few hours.
What about ice baths then?
They're best to be taken before you work out. If you take them after working out, because it's cold, so the vasoconstriction, vasodilation, it's poor. It sort of inhibits muscle growth a little bit.
That's interesting.
But only marginally.
Yeah, okay. Because I was going to say, like, whenever I see, like, on social media, it's like usually, like, somebody will say, oh, I've just done this really, really exercise, whatever. And then they'll be in, like, a tub in their garden or whatever, like, smash the ice, and then they'll be like, and go in and stuff like that. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, that's interesting because I don't know much stuff about these things, but like I knew that they help generally with recovery time, but then it's like like the different methods and things like that people
The cold
use.
immersion is fantastic. Yeah, I prefer that over sauna. It's really difficult initially, but cold immersion is fantastic. Even if you just have a cold bath or a cold shower and just getting in your swimming trunks or something like that, and just sit in it for 5-10 minutes or whatever, it's fantastic. I think you could replace caffeine with like a cold shower. Instead of drinking 3 cups of coffee and being completely reliant on coffee your entire life to get yourself through all these things, just take a cold shower instead. It feels so much better.
There you go. There's some advice for your podcast listeners. Take a cold shower.
Stimulants.
It's a really great strategy for that 3 p.m. lull in the day. After post-lunch.
And you're feeling sluggish.
Have a cold shower. It really perks you up.
Well, 100%. Yeah, I agree with that.
I'll just take, if I'm at work, I'll just get somebody to tip a bucket of ice water over my head mid-lecture or something.
Go under the tap and splash yourself with cold water.
Yeah.
Just, it's simple as that.
Yeah, that has a quite innate reaction as well, doesn't it? You sort of gasp, don't you? As if you were drowning, you go like that, and it really almost like activates your fight or flight response, doesn't it?
Exactly.
When you throw water on your
note
face.
to self: ice baths, saunas.
Enjoy
Okay, well I'll let you know. I'll let you know how I get on with those.
Yeah. I remember it was used as an intervention for people who were having suicidal ideation, wasn't it? To do cold immersion.
Oh, okay.
And it was really, really successful. I can't remember what it was. It was like a breathing exercise and then cold immersion.
They're similar to like a Wim Hof method. Combined with the cold bath. Were they synchronous? Were they together? Would you do the breathing after or during the cold thing?
On the intervention that we were told about, it was a guided meditation with breathing and then a cold immersion.
So you do that after. Yeah.
I wonder what do you think the cold immersion element? So what do you think? Because that's interesting, like suicidal ideation. Because I think one of the things that I've seen in terms of like just the literature generally, but also like recommendations that they offer is like, so if people are like thinking about self-harm or anything, I think one of the recommendations, I can't remember who it was provided by. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's like I think they say like the use of ice. Because it can induce pain, of course.
As like a self-harm
so I was thinking, like, a safe self-harm alternative. I mean, like, I don't know if it's the same in that case, but does it provide some of that sort of?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
That sort of goes beyond the benefits of the ice bath, doesn't it? Is that it also this complementary aspect is that the pain is also a nice alternative.
That's what I was thinking.
I think the one quite common one is an elastic band.
Flicking it against yourself.
Oh, that could really work actually. Yeah.
Shall we transition into about the Dan?
Yeah. Yeah. Should we go on to? We've got so many random things to discuss.
Much to ask
yeah.
You've been looking at this piece of paper in dread.
Quick fire.
I can see him looking at it.
Yeah. Thank you for.
No, you're honestly welcome.
Really
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I hope I do a good job for you and give some insight.